Hello and welcome to my weekly podcast through the Bible in who knows how many years. This is Lent of 2024, and I've been going through Mark's Passion narrative and working on my explanatory notes over Mark's Passion. Last week, we looked at the triumphal entry, which relates to Palm Sunday. And today I want to look at at Monday of Passion Week, at least in Mark's Gospel. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus makes, and also Luke, by the way, Jesus makes his triumphal entry and throws the money changers out of the temple as he arrives. But in Mark, it's the next day. And so here we are in Mark chapter 11, beginning with verse 12, and let's do this incident that's often called the cleansing of the temple, Jesus' action in the temple. Okay, now there is a bracketing of the story of the cleansing of the temple with this little vignette about the fig tree. And I think probably for most of us, when we first see the fig tree story play out, we're kind of like, what'd that tree ever do to you? What's going on here? But you could argue that what we have here is a kind of sandwich. The technical term for it I learned in seminary was an intercalation. You have the bread of the sandwich, which is fig tree part 1. You have the meat of the sandwich, which is the cleansing of the temple. And then you have the other bread of the sandwich, which is the rest of the story of the fig tree. And so the story of the fig tree actually frames Jesus' action in the temple. So let's go ahead and begin with verse 12 of Mark 11, and we'll start with fig tree part 1. So verse 12. And on the next day, them having come from Bethany, which again is about 2 miles from Jerusalem, Jesus was hungry. Interestingly, Jesus was human. You were in doubt, right? No. We do sometimes act like Jesus wasn't human, but indeed Jesus was human. And here we have another indication because he's hungry. He did eat. He didn't, he's not just playing a game. I think I heard someone say that once, that they thought Jesus was just pretending to be hungry. No, it says here he was hungry. Verse 13, and having seen a fig tree from afar that had leaf. So we're talking spring here probably, but maybe not too far into the spring. The fig tree has leaf, but it's really not time for fruit yet, it would seem. Having seen a fig tree from afar that had leaf, he came to see if he would see something on the tree. And having come upon the tree, he found nothing except leaves, for the season of figs was not yet. Now, this is an illustration again, but it does indicate, as we're going to see, that Jesus could get angry. And of course, in the temple, Jesus will get angry. I think really angry, truly angry, not just scripting it out or faking it. He really gets angry, which there's another lesson there. We believe Jesus was without sin, and yet Jesus could get angry. So apparently, anger in and of itself is not sinful. It's what you do with the anger where we get into the moral zone. If you get angry and you hurt someone, then you've sinned. You've got sin, but if you just get angry and you discipline your emotions and you don't let it lead you to do something you should not do, then it's not sin. It's just an emotion. As one person once said, emotions are neither good nor bad in themselves. They just are. And so we're going to see Jesus get angry at the fig tree, it would seem here. He didn't find anything, even though it wasn't the season. But the point is, this is an illustration of Israel, of that day, of course. That the Israel of that day, Jesus came to his own, and his own received him not, as John 1 says. And so the judgment of Israel, and the New Testament does understand the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. The New Testament does understand that as God's judgment on Israel for its rejection of Jesus. And I think this passage here a strong indicator of that as well. So he sees the fig tree from afar. He sees it has leaf. By the way, it also indicates that he is not operating with omniscience at this point. This is very clear in Mark 13, which we looked at a few weeks ago, because he says, "No one knows the day or the hour, not even the Son." Well, this is not ambiguous in the slightest. Jesus, so we are hearing about the humanness of Jesus from Mark here. We are hearing that he gets hungry, we are hearing that he gets angry, and we are hearing that he doesn't know everything. Again, as the divine second person of the Trinity, we believe by faith that somewhere in there he did know everything, but when he was operating as a human, he did not access his omniscience apparently. He didn't know that the fig tree didn't have fruit until he went up to it and observed it. So verse 14, "And having answered, he said to it, 'No longer forever from you may anyone eat fruit.' And his disciples were hearing him." Now, this is not, of course, necessarily true of Israel, although I'm sure that some have taken it that way in the past, that that's the end of Israel, and now Israel's been replaced by the church. Someone might say replacement theology. I don't think the New Testament bears that out by and large, although, as we might as well go ahead and say it now, obviously Israel doesn't get a pass when it's unrighteous. It's very clear that God does judge Israel. This is the point of Jeremiah, right? You say, "This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord." God's not going to destroy Israel, and God allowed Israel to be destroyed. And so Israel does not get a moral pass from God simply because they're God's people. That's against the whole Old Testament, right? And so I think there is a tendency to assume that modern day Israel is Christian. Well, it's not at all Christian. It is, in fact, in some respects, anti-Christian internally. Now, it's glad to take the money of Christians. It's glad to have Christian visitors helping its economy, yes. But in terms of its ideology and its theology and its understanding of God, the nation of Israel is not Christian in the slightest. In fact, perhaps until recently, and maybe even still, there are more Palestinian Christians in Bethlehem and in Nazareth, for example, than there are Jewish Christians in Israel. These are kind of reset buttons when we are thinking of contemporary politics. There's a tendency to just kind of sanctify everything that Israel might do. And that's not actually biblical. In fact, it's not at all biblical. It's not biblical in the slightest. So Paul says in Romans 10 or Romans 9 that Israel has a place of honor. God's biological people have a place of honor for sure. But there is nothing in the Bible that suggests that Israel can do whatever it wants. I mean, obviously, that's not true of any nation. It's not true of America. That God will judge all people according to whether or not they do good, whether or not they do right. What does God say to Cain? "If you do right, won't you be accepted?" That's true of all people. It's true of Christians. If Christians do right, they'll be accepted. But Christians don't get a pass. God will judge the church. God will judge Christians. And so there's a kind of a blind spot, it seems to me, when it comes to modern Israel, that we just assume that whatever they do is right, or maybe we don't assume that, but we act like it. And again, I'm not going to speak to any particular specific historical event. I just merely want to point out what's biblically clear, and we listen to the Bible, right? It's overwhelmingly clear in the Bible that God judges people according to their action that results from their faith. As James says, "You show me your faith without works, and I'll show you my faith by my works." A faith that does not lead to action does not compute. That's nothing biblically. That's not faith. It's actually not even faith. And so, again, I'm not in any way trying to cast aspersion This is internal talk amongst us Christians. Those of you who are listening, us Christians, this is the attitude we must have. This is the biblical attitude, and the attitude is this: that we must evaluate the moral worth of things according to, guess what? Their moral worth, not according to, well, I'm wearing a Christian badge and therefore I get a pass. I can beat you up because look, I'm a Christian. Survey says no. You will know they are Christians by the way they behave. If our actions do not match our professed faith, then our professed faith probably isn't accurate. So he curses the fig tree. Why? Because it didn't bear fruit. Wow, this is strange. Well, we're going to find out what's really going on. It's not really about the fig. It's about Israel. And so we get to verse 15 here. And by the way, if you're watching the video version of this, you are seeing my explanatory notes on Mark's Passion that I plan, cross your fingers, to publish before Passion Week this year. So now we come to the cleansing of the temple, verse 15. Jesus comes to Jerusalem, and having entered into the temple, he began to throw out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple, the tables of the money changers, the seats of the ones who were selling doves. He overturned them. Verse 16, he wasn't allowing anyone to bring a vessel through the temple. Now, this could be a symbolic in action. I think E.P. Sanders suggests that Jesus is symbolically predicting the destruction of the temple. Of course, maybe, because we are going to hear in Mark 13 prophecies about the destruction of the temple. But I would say that the most logical or the most kind of obvious thing here is that Jesus is angry. He's angry at something. Now, what he's angry at might be a little bit ambiguous because there are different suggestions as to what Jesus is angry at here. But it would seem that the selling of stuff is ticking him off in some way. And so we need to figure out what that selling of stuff, what about it that's driving him nuts. Now, by the way, the selling, the exchange of money, the exchange of animals, this was a necessary operation of the temple. Because if you're coming from Greece for Passover, you're not going to bring a goat on the boat, or you're not going to walk a goat, from Greece to Palestine. No, you're going to bring money. This is what money's for, right? This is how money arose. You're going to bring money, and you're going to exchange that money for a goat when you get to Jerusalem. So the exchange was necessary. The question is, what was it about the money changing that ticked Jesus off? By the way, it is generally understood that this event suggests that Jesus wasn't a pure pacifist. Now, I do think that those who think of Jesus as a pacifist and think of the Christian life as a pacifist, that they are probably more correct than not correct. That Jesus' primary operating mode that he modeled and taught us was turn the other cheek, go an extra mile, give them your shirt. That the primary operating mode that Jesus models and teaches in the Gospels is one of peace rather than of even self-defense or one of force. But in the end, I just don't think that the Bible will at all sustain a purely pacifist perspective. It's messy. It's mixed. And that's difficult because we like consistency. And I'm not saying it's inconsistent. I'm saying it's easy to say it's always this. That's easy to say, well, sometimes it's this and sometimes it's not, and we have to have wisdom and discernment to know which is which. That's complicated, and by and large, we don't like complicated things. We are human beings. We're simple, finite, fallen humans. We keep it simple, stupid. Give me the billboard. Give me the ad. Give me the motto. Give me the punchline. We're not good with complexity. I think this is part of why people don't like colleges and universities, because they make me think too hard. I don't want to think hard, So keep it simple, stupid, right? That's the dominant way of communicating. But it would appear that theology is not just always one thing. Sometimes God wants us to suffer, and sometimes God wants us to act. And it takes wisdom to know which is which. And there just isn't a simple answer to say, always do it this way or always do it that way when it comes to this particular issue. Now, I would say Jesus says to love God and love neighbor. There's never an exception to that. That is always the case. But how does that play out? Well, sometimes it plays out one way. Sometimes it plays out another. It's complicated. It's messy. And so, yes, Jesus was the Prince of Peace. Yes, Jesus said, turn the other cheek. Yes, Jesus did model self-sacrifice and self-suffering. Is there a time to use force? Well, I hesitate to say it because as soon as you say, apparently there is a time for force, as soon as you say that, the people who like to show force are going to take advantage of it, and they're going to use it in a bad way. And I think history's full of that. I think that's part of why some people have said, nope, never use force, or God never uses force, or Jesus never used force. And it's just easy that way, right? To say that's always this way. But he throws the money changers out of the temple, and he uses force. Jesus forces them to leave the temple area. So apparently it's messy. I wish I could say it's always one thing or the other, but it doesn't seem to always be just one thing or another. Verse 17, and as Jesus was teaching and talking to them, he said, has it not been written, my house will be a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of thieves, a den of plunderers. Well, so there are a couple of hints here as to what's ticking Jesus off. I do think, and I can't prove it, but I do think that there must be something unjust going on about the way that they are exchanging the money. And of course, that's a situation, when you have a captive audience, you can take advantage of them. I remember as a young boy and a young man, we would ride on the Florida Turnpike because the I-95 wasn't fully open. You had to, unless you wanted to go completely back roads, you had to spend at least a little time on the Florida Turnpike. And of course, the Florida Turnpike had gas stations on it, but the gas was always much, much more expensive on the Turnpike. Why? You can't get on and off a Turnpike, right? You're stuck. And so if you need gas desperately on the Turnpike, you're going to pay extra for it because you have a captive audience. And, it was our families, I don't know that we talked much about it, but my dad for sure would fill up before he got on the Turnpike, so he didn't have to pay the exorbitant cost of buying gas on the Turnpike. Well, if you're in Jerusalem and you need a goat for sacrifice, guess what? They're going to charge you more, probably. There's a good chance that these money changers were taking advantage of those who were coming from afar you can't use that goat. It's got a blemish. Where? I don't see a blemish. Nope, right there I see the blemish. Well, I'm sorry, I'm the one that approves it. You're going to have to get an approved goat here for your sacrifice, or an approved turtle dove here. You can't use that one that you happen to have with you because it's not good enough. And so I suspect that the whole thing smelled off to Jesus. It smelled of people who were far more interested in making money than they were in the worship of God. They were distracted by making a shekel and had no, that basically they were, for all intents and purposes, oblivious to the actual purpose of the location they were at. And it ticked Jesus off. To him, and he, of course, is quoting the Old Testament here, that they're making it a house of thieves, where they're stealing money from the people, and this ticked Jesus off. And also, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, from Isaiah 56:7. Some have suggested from, I think, John, that Jesus is in the court of that this money changing is taking place in the court of the Gentiles. That is, they are preventing Gentiles from worshiping the Lord. Some have suggested that. And of course, if Mark's audience is primarily Gentile, then that would be an appropriate kind of critique that you're stopping non-Jews from worshiping by locating your place of business here in this particular place. And so Jesus doesn't like it, and he drives them out. It incenses him that they are using God's temple as a place to express their greed. Again, I'm reading into it, but I think that's not a unusual interpretation, and one that makes a lot of sense to me, given what Jesus does and says elsewhere. Verse 18, and the chief priests and the scribes, they heard about it, and they were seeking how they might destroy him, for they were fearing him, and the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. And then when it was late, they went back out of the city. So some have suggested that this event, more than any other, gets Jesus killed. It alarms, for example, the priests. The priests might not care much about, oh, here's another teacher saying stuff. Here's another corner street preacher. So the fact that Jesus was doing that sort of thing might not have bothered them. But when you kind of create a little bit of a mess, of a riot, not a riot, I mean, there aren't other people involved in it, but when you kind of stir things up in the temple, deep, 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 that kind of sets off their alarms, because of course the Romans are around. In fact, they were usually posted watching the temple area, looking for some kind of a disturbance. So whatever Jesus did, it must have been a fairly brief thing, or else the Romans would have swooped in, and they probably wouldn't have let him continue teaching if it had been too major of an action. But this probably set off the alarm bells of the Sadducees and the priests, kind of saying, "Watch out! This guy's going to cause trouble, and we don't want any trouble with the Romans. We've got a really nice life going on here." Sadducees and Pharisees and chief priests might have said. But Jesus teaches in the temple, and then the day is over. So that's the event of the money changers in the temple. Now we return to the fig tree. The fig tree, part 2, verse 20. And going along early the next day, so now we're on Tuesday, he sees the fig having been withered from its roots. Verse 21. And Peter, having remembered, says to Jesus, "Teacher, look, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you had cursed has withered." And this is probably a symbolic embodiment or prophetic embodiment of the fact that the temple was going to be destroyed. And in the year AD 70, indeed, Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed. This was a time of heightened nationalism. The Jewish War that started in 66. We're going to get our country back. We're going to be independent. We're going to kick these Romans out of here. We're going to once more become the kingdom of Israel, and we're going to have a king, and we're going to have a Messiah, and we're going to return to the glory days of the past. So Jewish nationalism was at its height in those years from 66 on, and I'm sure that if you said anything against it, that you were anathema, that you were probably even beat up. If you said anything against, well, I'm not sure we should be doing this, I'm not sure we should be doing that. No, this is the act of God, and kill you, beat you. I'm sure that was the kind of climate in those last days of the 60s. But of course, it was another Jeremiah situation, apparently, and God allows the Romans to come in and destroy the city of Jerusalem and destroy the temple and to destroy the people. And of course, they will march the Jewish elite through the city of Rome in Roman triumphal procession, and then put them all to death in disgrace there in Rome. And so the fig tree withering, this is anticipation, it would seem. Now, Mark may be writing after the temple, just, there may be a Mark being written around 69, and then maybe reaching its final form, right after these events, perhaps. That's not a crazy date to date Mark to around 69 to 71, surrounding that particular time in history. And so probably a time of great distress and demoralization for Israel. Not a real happy time if you're an Israelite or a Jew at that particular time. Now, so the fig tree seems to bracket or sandwich Jesus' action in the temple, and they interpret each other, right? The fig tree has no fruit, it must wither. Israel's not bringing forth fruit, it must wither. We got to be very careful not to use this as an excuse for anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism, as it has been used often throughout Christian history, kind of an excuse to beat up on Jews. And it's amazing how we can take we can take good things and make them evil. And certainly this kind of sense of the judgment of Israel has been used for evil by Christians or people calling themselves Christians throughout history. So we do not want to do that. It's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, nobody gets a pass just because of who they are. Israel does not get a pass just because they're Israel. But this is no excuse to be anti-Israel. And it's incredibly difficult for us puny little humans to keep these kinds of things in tension. It's one way or the other. We're all or nothing. We're not people of moderation, human beings. We're not people of balance. We're not people of wisdom and discernment. We're people of extreme. This is who we are. We can't handle two things being true at the same time that are kind of parables or proverbs. But this is the message, that we take away from these stories. That one, nobody gets a pass just because of who they are, and yet there is honor, for example, for Israel, and that's no excuse to hate. We don't get a pass to hate the people who don't get a pass. Man, our human brains are so easily manipulated. Verse 22, and having answered, Jesus says to them, have trust in God. Truly I say to you, that whoever should say to this mountain, be raised and be cast into the sea, and will not doubt in his or her heart, but have faith that what they are saying is going to happen, it will be. So in Mark, it kind of goes off into the power of Jesus with regard to the fig tree. This pericope ends with Jesus talking about faith, that if you have enough faith, you'll be able to move mountains. And so kind of a side message here with regard to the fig tree. It's a little bit hyperbolic. I don't think Jesus is ever predicting that anybody will move Mount Ararat or anything like that, or Mount Everest. It's a extreme exaggeration, hyperbole, to make a point. He's not suggesting that Christians will be able to use telekinesis or levitate things. It's exaggerated speech. He's basically saying that we don't exercise our faith as much as we might exercise our faith, that if we had more faith, more things would happen. Verse 24, because of this I say to you, everything you pray for and ask, have faith that you've received it, and it will be to you. Now, of course, there's a catch-22 here. We have to pray according to his will, as it says in other parallel passages. James 4:15 I mentioned in my explanatory notes. We must pray if the Lord wills. And so this is not just a pass for selfish prayers. Lord, I would like a banana split now. Hey, where's my banana split? I believed you. It's not about selfish praying, but it's about praying in alignment with God's will. When we are in alignment with God's will and we pray and we ask that there's wiggle room in here. I believe that God allows our prayers to determine the future in some cases, that God may actually be waiting for us to pray before he decides, as it were, which path he's going to take. Now, he knows what we're going to decide, and he knows, therefore, which path he's going to take. But that in the infinite scheme of things, I believe that God sometimes leaves the path of the future indeterminate, depending on our prayer, whether we're going to pray or not pray. And so I don't think it's just, we're just praying according to the way he moves the sock puppet, but that we there is some flexibility in God's plan for the future, that he leaves open the possibility that our prayers might actually determine the future. Verse 25, and whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have something against someone, so that your Father in the heavens might forgive you your transgressions as well. So we don't get forgiveness if we don't forgive others. That's a scary thought, isn't it? That our being forgiven might be contingent on our forgiving other people, but that's clearly what the Scripture says. That's clearly what Jesus says. That's clearly what the gospel says. If we have unforgiving hearts toward others, toward anyone, if we have hateful hearts toward others, our prayers will not be answered. God will not forgive us. God will not allow us a pass if we don't have a heart willing to forgive others. That doesn't mean that we let them run all over us. It doesn't mean that we even like them. It doesn't mean that we like them. Certainly doesn't mean that we open ourselves up to being abused by them. It means that we are open for their restoration, and that we want them to be restored if they will make the move. So this is, of course, a miracle of God's grace. We can't do it in our own human power. It's going to take a little help from the Holy Spirit to be able to forgive people who have genuinely done us wrong. And yet, Jesus says if we can't forgive others, then God's not going to forgive us. That's pretty scary. There is a verse that is in later manuscripts, but not in earlier manuscripts, and that's 11:26. It reads, "If you do not forgive, neither will your Father in the skies forgive your transgressions." Now, I've been talking as if that's true because it's in the Gospel of Matthew. It's in Matthew chapter 6. And so what I'm saying, that that teaching is scriptural. The question is just whether it was in the first copy of Mark or not. Now, in general, the textual tradition fixed things. When intentionality was involved, the textual transmission fixed things rather than messed them up. Now, sometimes accidentally they mess things up. So it seems fairly obvious that what happened here is that a copyist either completed what was missing in Mark, or without thinking inserted what the copyist knew from Matthew. By the late 300s, we have a very smooth worship text of the New Testament. And so what happened is, in those first few hundred years, there was a smoothing out of various things. So, for example, in the earliest copies of Matthew and Mark, Matthew had this statement, "If you don't forgive, neither will your Father in the skies forgive your transgressions," but Mark did not. And so at some point, whether intentionally or accidentally, a copyist harmonizes those two together. And so by the late 300s, we have a very nice worship text in which both Matthew and Mark have that saying. But it makes more sense that the saying in Mark 11:26 would be added to Mark to harmonize and smooth out the difference between Matthew and Mark, than for some inexplicable reason for a copyist of Mark to take it out. That's just not the way it happened. And so you can see there's a fundamentally wrong mindset about some of the King James only approach, which is kind of like they're trying to take stuff out of the Bible. No, they're not trying to take stuff out of the Bible. It's simply that in the first few hundred years, there was a harmonizing of the text, especially for worship. And this harmonizing added stuff in like this to harmonize Matthew and Mark. They did not harmonize by taking stuff out. They harmonized by adding stuff in. And so usually the shorter reading, not always, but the shorter reading is usually the more original reading. At least that's our default starting point. And so Mark, the original copy of Mark, probably did not have this verse, 11:26. No, there's no conspiracy. There's no evil fiend thing going on here. There's no attempt to corrupt the Bible. No. It's rather that in the first few centuries of the church, there was a harmonizing of the text for worship. And at some point, 11:26 was probably added to Mark to harmonize it with the text of Matthew. Well, this has been the cleansing of the temple in the last part of Mark 11, and we've seen that the cleansing of the temple act is bracketed by the cursing of the fig tree. And this is a implicit prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, I may not be right on everything, but this has been my attempt to do a Through the Bible in 10 plus years on Mark, last part of 11.